Jimmy Fallon has a segment on his show where he starts a hashtag on Twitter and then encourages people to tweet out things that are based on that topic. And so I think my favorite topic was hashtag my dumb argument. And here were some of the responses. At Christian Rose 123, she tweeted out, "One time my parents got into a fight because my dad tried to convince my mom that his leg pain was more painful than her childbirth." We've been in that argument before. Okay, here's another one. At Nikki Bow tweeted out, "Caught in a traffic jam, yelled at a guy. 'Have a nice day.' He yelled back, 'No, I won't have a nice day.'" Here's another one. Another guy tweeted this out. "My friend was mad because I was mean to her in a dream that she had. We argued whether or not I was responsible for my actions." We've all had arguments. How many of you have had arguments before? Would you raise your hand? Yeah, I'll turn away so not to think poorly of you. How many of you ever had an argument with a Christian before? Would you raise your hand? The Bible is not estranged and distant from our disagreements. Actually, the Bible speaks into them. In marriage, some think the only way to deal with problems is to fight or flight. I'm either yelling or I'm running. Some families are not trained on how to deal with disagreements, and their family reunions are nothing more than just a big, giant, bickering fest. Or here's what I want to give you today from the text. I want to speak on this topic: gospel-centered problem solving. And here's what I want to do. First, I want to show you the problem in the text. Then I want to show you the pattern that they use to fix the problem. Then I want to show you some practical implications of this to many of the common problems we deal with. Like, how do we deal with theological disagreements? How do we deal with Christian freedom disagreements? J.D. Greear preached on this passage, and he entitled it, "When Drinking, Politics, Cursing, and Circumcision Divide the Church." How do we deal with work fights, family disagreements, church fights? How do you handle broken friendships? I want to deal with all of that today. Gospel-centered problem solving. Really, every Sunday I bring the same message. I don't know if any of you cook or not, but if you cook, I don't. But say that like I cook. I don't cook. But if you cook, some of you've tenderized meat before. You let it soak in a solution, you marinate it, and then when the heat is applied, there's a pleasant taste that comes out of your mouth. Why? Because the meat is tenderized. Here's what I want to do today. I want to gospelize you. I want to marinate you with the gospel. So it affects how you view politics, how you view art, how you view music, and how you view disagreements. And I don't want you, as we walk into Acts chapter 15, to like you're walking in and you're an hour late for the movie. Okay, so let me catch you up to where we're at in this particular text. The book of Acts is a birthday story. The church was born in fire and on fire. It's about 15 years after Jesus died and rose again. And God's grace has overflowed the banks of the Jewish river, and now Gentiles are being saved everywhere. And you may read the Bible and wonder, where are Americans? Where are we at? Some of you are not Americans, but you may wonder, where are we at? We are Gentiles. Just recently, we had Jeff and Ricky Miller over to our house, and they were telling us how Ricky's father came to Christ and how he was learning and growing in his walk with Christ and how he was opening the Bible and had an aha moment right in the kitchen at the kitchen table. He looked at Ricky and he said, "Did you know that we are Gentiles?" And she smiled and said, "Yes, Dad, I knew that." I want us to have one of those aha moments today because it needs to hit us fresh that you are a Gentile. And in this text, God is bringing you into the family. Acts chapter 15 is a watershed moment in the Bible. It's a continental divide. The world will never be the same after this event. So let's look at the problem. The problem's found in Acts chapter 15, verses 1 through 5. What's taking place is there is a trickle of Gentile conversions, but it was fast becoming a torrent. there will soon be more Gentile Christians than Jewish Christians. And the Jews didn't know what to do with that. They didn't know what to do with the influx of non-Jews. And they feared losing the purity of their Jewish stock. And their beef was not really that Gentiles are becoming Christians, but it's rather that they were not first becoming Jews. They believed that Gentile converts to Christ had to go through a specific act called circumcision in order to be saved. And they were saying things like, Jesus was circumcised, and you're wearing your little band right here that says WWJD. What would Jesus do? I'll tell you what Jesus would do. Jesus would get circumcised. So stop by Mount Sinai before you go to Mount Calvary. And the Jews were not saying that this was a post-conversion event, like after you get saved then you need to be circumcised. They were saying it was a pre-conversion event. In order to be saved, you need to be circumcised. Now, you say, what is circumcision? I'm not going to get into that. I'm going to let your small group leader tackle that this week, putting it right on their plate. But basically, they believed that in order to become a member of the church, you had to have a surgery. And I say church, not local church, but big church. Or if math is your thing, in order to be added to the church, part of you must be subtracted. Now, I would imagine that would hurt the attendance of the new membership class. We're going to have one here today. Husbands were in their car telling their wives, you know what? Their expectations are just a little cut above what I'm interested in. So why don't you just go on without me? I'm going to stay outside and watch the game on my phone. So I was reading the passage this week and wondering, why was this story in the Bible? At the beginning of the week, I had jury duty, and Sarah was telling me, you need to text Dan and have Dan preach for you this week. You're going to have jury duty all week. And I said, no, I can handle it. I started digging around in this text. I found out that it was about circumcision, and I thought, this is a good week for Dan to preach. Let me text Dan. So why is this story in the Bible? Well, it's not in the Bible for two reasons. It's not in the Bible, number one, to show us that we need to have a massive church business meeting with every Christian in a 400-mile radius every time we have a disagreement. That's not why it's in the Bible. Kevin DeYoung was preaching this passage, and he thinks this church council is an excellent example of Presbyterianism. I think old Kev has missed it here. This teaching has nothing to do with church polity. It's not what this passage is teaching us. I also don't think that this passage is teaching you when you should circumcise or if you should circumcise your baby boy or not. Some cultures do it, some cultures don't. It just depends. The Jews did, the Gentiles did not. Some things in Acts are descriptive and not prescriptive. Descriptive meaning they are describing what happened, not prescriptive, prescribing how it should be done. So why is this story in the Bible? Well, it's in there because it happened. But one of the things that we can glean from this is how we should handle disagreements when they arise in our lives. And the disagreement in our text is no small issue. We're not talking about the color of the carpet. We're not talking about what's the best brand of coffee. That's pretty easy, right? Number one, Dunkin' Donuts. Number two, Tim Hortons. If any of you have ever had Tim Hortons before, you are missing out. It's in Canada where my wife's from, actually in Michigan as well. Number three, McDonald's. Number 486, motor oil. Number 487, Starbucks. I mean, this isn't a big argument. This is huge. So here's the problem in a nutshell. There are two groups of people. The first group of people we call the Judaizers. The Judaizers' view was this: you can't be saved merely by grace. You have to have grace plus works. Salvation is Jesus plus circumcision. In order for you to be absorbed into Christ, you must be absorbed into Jewishness. In other words, let Moses complete what Jesus had begun. Let the law supplement the gospel. So that's the Judaizers' view. Then there's another group of people, I call them the Gospelizers. The Gospelizers' view was this: salvation is by faith alone, by grace alone. That's it. So hence the disagreement, and hence the argument in this church council. And I actually think that our hearts are naturally bent towards being a Judaizer. Like we constantly find ourselves on this performance treadmill, constantly checking how fast we're running, how long we spend in our quiet time, how faithful we are to this or this or this. We just throw up these rules. If you have to perform to make God happy, you just left the gospel. So don't be a Judaizer. Don't be a Jesus plus. That's what they were, a Jesus plus group. There's a whole world full of legalistic heads who always want to add something to salvation. Now, some people tack on baptism. Some people tack on church membership. Some say grace saves you, but that grace must be mediated through the sacraments. I'm telling you, there are all groups and tribes of people that try to add to salvation. They could be Catholics, they could be Baptists, they could be non-denominational. Any tribe that adds anything besides Jesus to salvation is the Jesus plus group. And here's some math for us. Jesus plus anything equals heresy. That's what this church council teaches us. Jesus plus nothing equals everything. Tacking something on to the perfect work of Christ done on the cross would be like me taking a pencil and going to touch up the Mona Lisa. I mean, it's just crazy. If you've ever seen me draw, you'd say that is crazy. I have no artistic ability. That's a masterpiece. Why are you touching that? But there are all types of people adding on must to grace. Like children with crayons scribbling on Rembrandts. God has worked out this beautiful grace system, and this passage is teaching us not to mess with it. So that's the problem. How did they handle their problem? Well, that's the pattern. In verses 6 through 41, we find the pattern of how they dealt with their disagreements and how we can deal with our disagreements. First, open up the lines of communication. That's what's taking place in verses 6 through 7. Once you start talking, half the battle is over. How many of you have ever been guilty of sharing a problem with someone that can't fix it? Yeah, I've definitely done that. That's what this passage is saying not to do. Don't share a problem with someone that can't fix it. When you're having an argument with your spouse, don't flee. Sit down and talk it out. When you have a problem with someone at work or with a family or whatever, here's a rule of mine. I never deal with any difficult subject or have a difficult conversation through text message or an email. I learned this when I was a seminary prof. Students were really bold behind a computer screen, but face-to-face, not so much. But sometimes it's hard to judge voice inflection through email. Email in all caps. Are you mad? Are you yelling? No, I'm just 70 years old. I don't know how to type small cap, It's hard to judge that. It's always better to do it face to face. I've seen people get fired, and they would have never been fired if they just had a conversation face to face instead of trying to do it over email. I've seen marriages destroyed by little tiny things that should have never destroyed a marriage, but they would never sit down without screens and screams and just talk things out. So how do we handle difficulties? The same way they did in the text. In verses 6 and 7, they're opening up the lines of communication. Then in verses 7 through 12, they're presenting their case. So present the case. When it's your turn, present the case. So I want to give you the setting. There's a big open area in Jerusalem. We've got church members there. We have elders there. We have apostles there. We don't have apostles anymore, but in this day, transitional period, there was apostles. There were lots of gospelizers and lots of Judaizers, and they're all gathered together to debate this circumcision thing. And then you're going to have people stand and present their case. The first one in verse 7 is Peter. Peter stands to present his case. And everyone expected Peter to take the Judaizer's side because he was a little elder brotherish. And his contribution to the argument was to remind the assembly of the Cornelius incident probably about 10 years previously. He says, the Gentiles are made clean not by surgery, not by just ritual purity, but by faith. And then notice in verse 11, Peter says something that stuns the congregation. And here's why. Because everyone expected him to say something like this. We believe the Gentiles can be saved by grace through faith in Christ, just like us. But notice in verse 11, Peter doesn't say that. Instead, he says, I believe we Jews can be saved by faith, just like these Gentiles. I mean, talk about shock. And then he just dropped the mic, and he said, Mamba out. That's in the Greek. You can't see it in the English there. This will be Peter's final appearance in the book of Acts. And what a way to go out. After he presents his case, Paul and Barnabas stand secondly to present their case. Now, I know that Paul was pretty worked up about the circumcision thing and this whole legalism thing because he wrote the book of Galatians while he was traveling to this church council. In Galatians, we find angry Paul, red-faced Paul. There are some things that should make us angry. Be angry and sin not. In verse 12, Paul and Barnabas pick up the mic that Peter just dropped, and again, they recount what God has done through them among the Gentiles. And then a third guy named James presents his case. The crowd was silent. Peter, Paul, and Barnabas had taken the wind out of the Judaizers' theological sails. And then we come to this guy, James. James was the half-brother of Jesus. Evidently, he was the moderator of this church council in Jerusalem. Growing up, he thought his brother Jesus was crazy. And I know that because he didn't even show up to his funeral. His friends would be like, my little brother thinks he's Superman. Well, my little brother thinks he's John Cena. James would be like, my little brother thinks he's God. They'd be like, man, your little brother's messed up. For his whole life, he thought his brother was crazy. But now he's standing saying he's not crazy. Well, what changed his mind? One thing. The resurrection of Jesus Christ. When his brother rose from the dead, it changed him. So James' major contribution in this church council was to shift the conversation to an eschatological one. He's quoting someone in the past. He's quoting Amos. So why is he bringing Amos in? Why is he bringing the Amos quote in? James is saying it's all in Amos. Amos predicted that the Gentile world would be penetrated with the gospel. Now let me stop here for a few applications. Just like the Jews, just like the Gentiles did not need to become Jews in order to be saved, you don't need to become an American in order to be saved. Your ethnicity does not help or hurt you in God's eyes. And now let me say the flip side of that as well, and that probably applies more to us. Just because you are an American doesn't mean you are saved. And I want to say that to those of you who think that Jesus looks like Kid Rock and that patriotism is the same thing as a relationship with Christ. Because it's not. Here's the second thing. You don't need to follow a set of laws in order to be saved. I was so engulfed in the biblical laws this week, I had to take a little break and study some state laws. So here's some state laws. This is extra. This has nothing to do with anything. I just thought I'd throw it out to you. Okay, let's laugh, people. All right, it's 9. We can laugh. It's illegal to tie an alligator to a fire hydrant in Detroit. In Texas, windshield wipers are required. A windshield is not. In Minnesota, it's considered a misdemeanor to operate, run, or participate in any activity where a pig is oiled up and released with the object of being recaptured. I wondered why you guys came, but that's why. We do that here in Kentucky, like, it's a church ministry. We're doing it next week. Look, the Jews love to make up some crazy laws as well, because the Bible didn't walk out the gray areas enough for them. And you see, legalists hate gray areas. They like black and white areas. And so they would debate at long length about whether a man wearing a false leg or a false tooth was bearing a burden on the Sabbath and was guilty of breaking the Sabbath command. There were just laws everywhere. There were 613 Jewish laws. Circumcision was just one of them. There were 612 others. So imagine Peter in this courtroom standing. He's presenting his case, and he's like, guys, I don't know about you, but I never felt like I was keeping all of them. And I was born a Jew. First, I couldn't keep them all straight. I mean, how far am I allowed to walk on the Sabbath again? Can we or can we not eat llama meat? Well, what about turkey bacon? And what about those yoga pants? Is that forbidden fabric or just really poor taste for men? You know, no matter how hard I tried, he says, I never felt like I was measuring up. What about you, Theudas? What about you, Bartholomew? So if we can't keep the laws and we are born Jews, why would we project that burden on the Gentiles? Peter is saying the whole point of the law was never to save you. If you think like Old Testament law, that's how you got saved back then, was keeping a bunch of rules. New Testament is by grace. You totally misunderstand the Bible. It's always been by grace. The purpose of the law was to show you that you are a lawbreaker and you need a law keeper to stand in your place. And Jesus is that law keeper. If you are here today and you're a skeptic towards Christ, we have them every Sunday in every service. Please hear me. Christianity is not about putting chains on. It's about chains falling off. Now here's a third application. Don't make it unnecessarily difficult for people to come to Christ. And that's what these people were doing, throwing all of these rules in front of people that Jesus never threw in front of people. They were making it unnecessarily difficult for people to come to Christ. And I think about that in my preaching. Like, I don't want to make it difficult for people here that are not Christians to come to Christ because I use some unfamiliar language. I use a bunch of big Christianese words. They're like, what in the world does that mean? I don't want to make it difficult for guests that are drawn into our church who have heard that God is at work here, but when they get to the facilities, it's a mess, or the parking lot is bad, or the kids' rooms are overcrowded. Like, we don't want to put unnecessary stuff in front of them. I don't want to make it difficult for Democrats or Republicans to come to Christ, and you do that by mixing secondary political positions with the gospel message. I don't want to make it difficult for Kentucky fans by rubbing it in their face that the North Carolina Tar Heels won the national championship last year. Or Tennessee fans. National. The mic just went out. They have had enough in the media room with me joking about Kentucky. Do you catch my drift here? We have a message that is life or death. No secondary message, no matter how important, should get in the way. So what's the pattern to deal with difficulties? Number one, open up the lines of communication. Just talk. That's half the battle. Number two, present your case. Number three, submit to the scriptures where it speaks to your argument. That's what's taking place in verses 13 through 18. They are submitting to the scriptures because it's speaking to their particular argument. Now, church councils and church conventions have no authority unless their conclusions are in accord with the scripture. So you say, Kyle, well, what happens if the Bible doesn't speak directly to my disagreement? What should I do then? Well, I would pray for wisdom. I would get godly counsel, not advice from that friend who every time something goes wrong, she blows up Facebook complaining about how she hates the world. But I'm talking like godly wisdom. Pray for wisdom, get godly counsel, and then respond in a way that adorns the gospel. So let me give you some practical implications. How do we work this out when we have theological disagreements? Theological disagreements. You've got a sheet of paper there that you would hand it on the way in. Let's take a look at that chart that I have. I'm calling here for theological triage. Some of you are in the medical field. We have a nurse and doctors here. What is medical triaging? Medical triaging means that shotgun wounds are treated before ankle sprains and seizures before bunions. I'm calling for theological triage. What is a theological triage? That's assigning priority to theological differences. It's the process of assorting differences into groups that are ranked in terms of importance. Years ago, Al Mohler wrote an article on a theological triage, and it's just impacted me. So I thought we would adapt and then bring it here today. Our goal as a church is to contend for the faith, but not to devour over preferences. We realize that there are no insignificant doctrines in this book. But where God is silent, we don't want to be loud. So let's look at the chart. I think there are different types of doctrines. I think there are first-order doctrines, second-order doctrines, third-order doctrines. Or you could put it like this: Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3. Tier 1 doctrines are things that you would die for. Those are hills to die on. You're not moving. Tier 2 doctrine, and this text right here, this was a Tier 1. Adding something to salvation, this was Tier 1. Tier 2, that's worth debating, but that's never breaking the unity. For instance, second-order doctrines are those, I have it written there for you, that are essential to church life and necessary for the ordering of a local church, but that in themselves do not define the gospel. Look, you and I agree on this. I stand pretty firmly here. You stand pretty firmly there. I'm not going to deny that you're a believer. You're not denying that I'm a believer, but we're just going to part ways here. It's hard for us to operate in the same local church if we differ on this. See, these are still believers. See, first tier doctrine, you've got believers and non-believers. They're denying the gospel. Second tier, you've got believers in both of them. They're just differing on some things. All right, then you've got tier 3. These are things that are worth discussing. These are just simply preferences. You can be in the same church and differ on these things, and it is no big deal at all. This chart teaches us 2 things. Number 1, not everything is worth fighting for. It's not. Some of you grew up in a tradition that did not triage well. I call them fighting fundamentalists. They fought so hard that the G fell off. Now they're just fighting fundamentalists. They fight about everything. It's crazy. Not everything is worth fighting for. Number 2, some things are worth fighting for, even dying for. They will have to pry my cold, dead hands away from the gospel. There are some things I will die for. There are hills I will die on. So where should we triage these things? I've got a whole list there for you. A lot of things. You say, are we going to go through them all? Come on. You know, of course we are. Of course we are. All right, number 1, verbal plenary inspiration. Yes, I think that's a hill that I would die on. That's number 1. Number 2, mode of baptism. I'll give you a little hint here. All the odd numbers are tier 1 for me. All of the odd numbers are tier 1 things. Those are hills that I would die on. Number 2 here, mode of baptism. I think most people would probably say 2 there. Some people may go 3 there. The doctrine of Christ's virgin birth. If you deny the virgin birth of Christ, you got to understand that's an attack on the gospel. It's not like a small thing. A lot of people say virgin just means young. It doesn't mean what we would associate, like never had intimacy before. No, that's actually an attack on the gospel. Once you lose that, you lose the gospel. Number 4, Bible versions. Look, that's a tier 3 thing. That's not a big deal at all. I don't care if you go to a church and they say, ain't no revival without the King James Bible. They need to realize God didn't write the Bible in English. All right? Number 5, the literal truth of all the miracles in the Bible. I will die on that hill. Number 6, music styles. I think that's 3. That's 3. That's tier 3 for me. That's preferential. We can be different on that and be in the same church. Charles Spurgeon took a very strong stance on this, and he's in heaven now. But I don't think old Spurgeon would take the strongest stance now because he's in heaven. I think he has a correct view of it. But he said manufactured music is no better than manufactured prayer. So he would not allow a piano in his church service. I think that's a little extreme. I think there's cultural differences in music. I judge music on the truth of the words. Truth is communicated through words, so let's judge the music on the words. Number 7, justification by faith alone. That's tier 1 for me. Number 8, Calvinism and non-Calvinism, or Calvinism and non-Reformed. I always tell people, if you wear Calvinism on your sleeve, you're not going to fit in here. If you wear non-Calvinism on your sleeve, you're not going to fit in here. You can't have your little pet agendas and last here. It's just not going to work, right? And we can't make these crazy arguments like, oh, you know, those Calvinist people, they don't believe in soul winning. Like, have you read? Do you know what it is? Do you know that's the craziest argument ever? Or non-Calvinist people, well, they're just not very intelligent. What? So we want to stay away from that. We don't have that problem here, so I just thought I'd throw it out there to you. All right, number 8, rejecting baptismal regeneration. That's people, they have a Jesus plus, and their plus is baptism. For instance, Duck Dynasty. Duck Dynasty, I'm not saying they believe this, but I'm saying the church that they are associated with believes this. That it's grace plus baptism, or as they would say it, getting dunked. So I would differ on that. You say, I can't believe you said something about Duck Dynasty. Look, we have all the seasons. We love Duck Dynasty. I'm not saying they believe that, but their church believes that. Okay, number 10, Christians' education. We have people here that homeschool. We have people here that have private education. We have people here that have public education. Don't overstep and don't take a stance stronger than Jesus did. My favorite verse on why you should homeschool is found in, oh wait, there's not a verse, right? So we're not going to take a strong stance on that. You've got people who say, they're public school people, like they really push for public school. And they're Christians. They say, we've taken all the salt and light out of the public schools and we've thrown them in Christian schools and home schools, and now our public schools are in this type of shape. And so they push public schools. And then you've got other people like, God gives a responsibility to teach children to parents and not to public schools. What I'm saying, that there's no verses on that, right? So however God leads you to do that, then you do that in good conscience. And we're not going to step on anyone else for doing that. Reject the prosperity gospel. I think that's big because I believe it's a different gospel. Most of TBN there. Okay, dress. I think modesty is cultural. What's modest in Florida in January is probably not modest in Michigan in January, right? Okay, let's go on down here. Political affiliation. We have Democrats here that are faithful leading in this church. We have Republicans here that are faithful leading in this church. We have independents that are not Republicans or Democrats because, they've got problems with submitting to people like me. That's what I am. I'm neither one. I'm like, you're not going to tag me with anything. So that's what I am. Inerrancy of Scripture. That's a hill to die on for me. Views on war. Some, it's like an all-in view. No matter what my country says, I'll go. They declare war on Canada tomorrow, all-in view. I'm going. We have people like that here. I'm not there. I'm like, what did Canada do? My wife's family is there. Why are we going that? They have Tim Hortons there. I like that coffee. Why are we doing that? Okay. But then there are others that would view this Augustinian view. That's the just war theory. We'll go to war if it's a just war. And so I think right now we're in a just war as well, and that's where I would fall. I'm not the all-in view, right? I'm not like I'm in Hitler's country, so if Hitler says let's kill all the Jews, we'll kill all the Jews. Not going to do that. But I'm in the just war view. Then there's pacifism. They think all war is evil, like Piper leans towards that. So we have different people probably among that in our congregation as well. So here's what I'm trying. Number 20, spiritual gifts. John MacArthur's a cessationist. He thinks the spiritual gifts has ceased. John Piper's a continuationist. He believes they have continued. He's really on the fringe of that, believing they have continued. But we have both probably in this church as well. The Trinity, verse 21, I think that's a hill to die on. This is where we would differ with Mormons, and this is where we would differ with Jehovah's Witnesses. We believe that Jesus is fully God. We believe that the Holy Spirit is fully God. Eschatology, pre-meal, post-meal, mid-trib, pre-trib, post-trib. I mean, it's just a lot going on there. I'm a pan-trib. You say, what is that? I think it's all going to pan out in the end. Substitutionary atonement, 24. What about beards, tattoos, and cigars? Look. I like them all right? Bodily resurrection of Christ, seeker-friendly movement. I would probably do the last one as maybe tier 2. Tier 2 with leadership, maybe tier 3 with attendance. It would be hard if you differed on that to do ministry together. It's a whole different philosophy. So I like what Newton said. Newton said of Paul, in non-essentials, Paul was a reed. In essentials, an iron pillar. He would not be moved. So here's what I want you to see in that chart. Legalists say that the third tier is just as important as the first. If there's any disagreement at all, we need to break fellowship. That's what legalists do. The third tier is just as important as the first. Liberals say that the first level is only as important as the third level. Hey, I mean, we differ on this political thing, and we also differ on this virgin birth of Christ. I mean, we differ on that. Let's just work together. No, that's liberal, right? That's an attack on the gospel. So there are some things we will stand. When, as a Christian, because you're a Christian, must you fight? Tier 1. Okay? So our arguments, here's the fourth one. Make concessions where you can. Make concessions where you can. First, James is addressing this Jesus plus group. Now he is about to address the Jesus only group. He asked them to be sensitive about 4 matters to refrain from them. And it's just this random list in verses 19 through 21. It includes don't drink blood and don't choke animals. It's really weird, and I wanted to skip over it, but it's there, so I had to deal with it, right? With the exception of the immorality command here, most scholars believe that the other 3 are no longer a matter of law, but it's a matter of love. So let me give you an example. Mrs. Gentile Christian invites Mrs. Jewish Christian over for a meal. And then she says, hey, where do you shop? This roast is terrific. And she says, well, I'll tell you, there's a little place at the back of the Temple of Diana. They have the greatest meat, the greatest prices. It's terrific. You know what happens? Mrs. Jewish Christian and her whole little family, they get retroactive stomachache. They're like, are you serious? Was the blood drained properly? Had that meat been offered to idols? Now you may think in this passage, Kyle, I thought all food was declared clean a couple of chapters ago, and now it's like they're saying stay away from these foods. All food was declared clean, but this is not about menu. This is about venue. James is no longer dealing with the definition of Christianity, but the demonstration of Christianity. He's saying this, that you're a Christian and you have freedom to do all of these things, but don't flaunt your freedom. In the company of a weaker brother, lay some things down. Tony Morita says it like this: as those under grace, we are not to make extra biblical requirements of them. And as those under grace, we gladly restrict our freedom for the sake of others. So let's talk about Christian freedom arguments. Okay, let's talk about drinking alcohol, smoking cigars, politics, and cursing. Let's just bring it all out, okay? Let's talk about drinking first. I'll make half of you mad, and then I'll come at it from the other side and make the other half of you mad, and then everybody will be mad, and you'll have something in common, right? Okay, all right, drinking. If you abstain from alcohol, if you say, you know what, Kyle, I don't drink it, I don't do it. If you abstain from alcohol on the basis of it gives you favor with God, then that's horrible. Okay, it doesn't give you favor with God. It doesn't make God smile on you whether you drink a glass of wine or not. But if you abstain on the basis of wisdom and witness, then I would say good for you. The Bible often speaks negatively of alcohol, warning of its dangers. The New York Times had an article, said 1 out of 6 people who ever take a drink of alcohol, become seriously addicted to it. I wouldn't keep a dog in my house that attacked 1 out of 6 people. 100,000 people die as a result of alcohol-related deaths each year. So if you refrain from alcohol because of those things, then I commend you for thinking this way. That's very conscientious and loving toward your brothers, your fellow men and women. But others say, and let me do the flip side here, well, just because something is abused doesn't mean we should get rid of it totally. Sex is abused. Should we get rid of it? Words are abused. Should we quit talking? Food is abused. Should we quit eating? And when you talk about things that kill, last year, 100,000 deaths were related to alcohol. 300,000 deaths were related to obesity. And nobody's out advocating to get rid of desserts, right? Even though the Bible warns of alcohol and the dangers, and it does, we clearly see people in the New Testament drinking fermented beverages, alcoholic wine, including Jesus. At one point, Paul even prescribes it for Timothy. That is 2 sides. Good arguments. So here's what a lot of churches do. Instead of leaving it an issue of conscience, some churches, they pick a side and they make a law. Like, okay, if you're going to join this church, you better sign the covenant that you're never going to drink again. It seems to me that we ought to leave it as a matter of conscience. And we should try in deference to one another not to offend them, not to offend the other brother. Now, some of you hear that on alcohol and you're thinking like, man, I can't wait to throw this in the face of my small group. I'm going to open up a Heineken in front of them tonight. Well, that just shows how selfish and all about me you are, right? They told the Gentiles, Don't throw this in the face of your fellow Jewish Christians. You can do it. You have the freedom to do it. But you've got to understand they have a background. They have a past. They have a cultural thing. And when they see you partaking of whatever it is, it conjures up all sorts of things and past in their mind. Someone invited a family member of mine to a small group, and they wanted to make a point of contact with him, so they offered him a beer. And I appreciate the point of contact, but not a smart move because he's an alcoholic. My wife's uncle was killed by a drunk driver. So I don't want to make light of it. That's what I'm saying. I don't want to make light of it. But for way too long, I think the church has been more concerned with what's in people's refrigerator than what's in their heart. So let me just put it bluntly to you. Could you walk away from alcohol for 30 days? If not, you're addicted. And if that question makes you angry, then I attacked your idol. And alcohol really isn't the problem. The heart is the problem. It's a symptom. So you notice Jesus. You say, did Jesus ever go to bars and clubs? I think yes. Now, there were bars and clubs in his day. Didn't quite look like bars and clubs in our day. But what did he do there? He saw people saved there. He saw conversions there. That's where Jesus hung out. All right, so that's drinking. You have complete freedom to do that. There are no restrictions in the Bible against that. But realize there are some weaker brothers who maybe have a past or something like that going on. Second, smoking. Kyle, will smoking a cigar send me to hell? It's not going to do that. It's not going to do it. It may make you smell like you've been there, but it's not going to do that. All right? Charles Spurgeon, my mentor, lived in London and he pastored. And back then, you could just throw someone's face on anything. Well, he smoked big old cigars and he had a church of 6,000 people. He was the most popular person in London, England at the time. Well, all the cigar companies would put his face on the cigar boxes. They didn't have to ask him. They'd say, your face helps us sell stuff, so we're going to do it. And he would have other preachers that would come to him and say, like, I can't believe you smoke cigars. I can't believe you do that. It's a bad testimony. And here's what Spurgeon did. Spurgeon took out a cigar, and he lit it right in these preachers' face, and he said, I'm going to smoke this cigar to the glory of God. Now, that's opposite of what you should do, all right? But this is probably what I would do, right? This is it. Or you say, well, what if your body is the temple of God and smoking hurts your body? I would totally agree with that as well. My grandfather passed away because of lung cancer. He would smoke while he was on the oxygen tank. And he would say, hey, can you give me those cigarettes? I'm like, Granddaddy, are we going to blow up? You've got oxygen right there. Get me the cigarettes. I said, yes, sir. I'll take it over. To be consistent with your body is the temple argument, we would have to do away with Twinkies as well, right? And I'm all for it. If you want to do away with cigars and Twinkies, I say go right ahead. All right, what about cursing? When Sarah and I moved here, Sarah's from Canada, I'm from North Carolina, close to Raleigh, we would always just be struck by how the use of language by even like some farmers. So words that we were taught were curse words were just like everyday words. They just throw it out there and be like, whoa, well, it just shocked me, right? So you say, what makes a curse word? What does not make a curse word? No chapter and verse for that, right? We don't want to judge someone's heart and culture, especially someone that is maybe new in this thing, and we have that type of church. We just do. I have people tell me, Pastor, that was the Hell of a sermon. And I'm like, thanks. Throws me off for a minute, but it's good. And preaching on some truths like the prodigal son and seeing people that are just getting it for the first time. They're just getting what grace is and how sweet and wonderful and irresistible this Christ is. And then they're listening, and then I'll hear them whisper, D-A-M-N. And I'm like, man, he just worshiped with a curse word. What is that? So cursing, all right? Politics. I think the Bible shapes how you should think about everything, including politics. Let me just point out a couple of Jesus' followers. Simon the Zealot, he believed that Israel should succeed from Rome and do whatever they needed to do. Matthew the tax collector, he was a tax collector. So both following Jesus, you have a Tea Party conservative and a liberal in the same church, in the same body of Christ following. What about church arguments? All right, how do you deal with church arguments, Kyle? Andy Stanley and J.D. Greer talk about several drifts from this text warning us to avoid. Drifts that churches take so often. Here's 2 drifts. Let me just give them to you. I didn't do them all, but just 2. The drift from a passion for outsiders to pacifying insiders. It's sad to go in churches that are chained up by traditions. Group of people that have been in those same seats since the Revolutionary War. You know, the average age is 95. If you're in your 40s, you're in the youth group. I went to a 1940s wedding yesterday. Everybody was in 40s garb. And I walked in thinking, like, this is like some churches. You know, people are just dressing up for this, but this is what some churches look like on a Sunday morning. But what happened? These churches, they won't change, even though they can see they're not reaching the next generation. And I think it's sad because they love their tradition more than they love their grandchildren. When I came to this church, I said, I'm going to change everything you love about this church. And they said, as long as it's not the gospel, do it. We've both kept our word there. All right, here's the second drift, a drift from grace to law. Now, some of the ones calling out for circumcision, I believe, were saved. I believe they were true believers. They believed they were saved by putting their faith in Christ, but after they started to drift back toward a rule-based relationship with Christ. And that's what always happens. We constantly drift back to the law. Luther said our hearts are hardwired for works righteousness. Now you say, Kyle, circumcision's not a big thing for me. Not going to put that in the way of anyone coming to Christ. Well, we have our own list of things where they say, if you want to do these, you do these to be right with God. They're never bad things. Never bad things. Sometimes they're good things, like, are you involved in a ministry? Do you have a quiet time? What small group are you a part of? How many people have you shared Christ with today? Do you adopt? Do you send your kids to public school? Do you send your kids to private school? Do you homeschool? Good things. But these things, if they become a measure of spiritual lives, they become circumcision. So not only does this make us lose the gospel in our own lives, but it makes it difficult for others to come to God. Jesus' last words on the cross was, "It is finished," not, "Go fix yourselves." So that means at any moment, you can be fully right with God, no matter how lost you are. It is as finished for you, my friend, as it is for anyone. Come to Christ. Don't say, I'm going to clean up first. Let me give you this last one quick. Friendship disagreements. This is found in verses 36 through 41. We're about to see the dream team break up. Paul said to Barnabas, let's visit all the churches that we started our first missionary journey. And Barnabas was like, okay, let's swing by and pick up my nephew, John Mark. Paul was like, you better slow your roll. He bailed out on us the last time we took him. You remember in the text when Rachel was reading, there was a sharp disagreement among these two brothers. The Greek word there pictures red face, bulging veins, heated arguments. Now, why did John Mark leave in Acts chapter 13, the first missionary journey? Why did he bounce on them? We don't know. He could have been homesick. He could have been upset with Paul because Uncle Barney was no longer the leader in that team. He could have had a bad illness. He could have been round around the middle and didn't want to make the trip. Paul, I'm going to pass on that 900-mile journey to the Tarsus River. My couch is calling me. You say, well, who was right? Was it Paul or Barnabas? We don't know. Luke gives no judgment on who was right or who was wrong. They both had reasonable concerns. Kent Hughes says it right. He says, our heart goes with Barnabas, and our judgment goes with Paul. So therein lies the tension. One was strong on grace, one was strong on truth. You should understand this. Good men and good women who love Jesus can have disagreements. And the Bible is a fairy tale. So if you're here today and you're not a Christian, we're not hiding that we have disagreements with people. The Bible isn't a fairy tale, but we have something to deal with the disagreements, and it's called the gospel. Here's Paul's position. I'm going to war, and I need to know that I have this guy, and he's got my back. I'm getting stoned in these cities. John Mark's going to run out on me again. I can't count on him. Here's Barney's position. God is a God of second chances. It's okay for John Mark to get scared if someone says they're going to kill him. Most people would be scared about that, Paul. Like, understand, Paul and Barnabas, history here. They loved one another. They were not like friends. They were more like brothers. Barnabas stuck up for Paul when Paul came to Christ and the church rejected him. Barnabas discipled Paul. Barnabas had never seen anyone like Paul before. You could not get two closer friends than these two. If it could happen to them, it could happen to you and your closest friend. And for some of you, it has happened recently. And you say, well, what do I do? Well, you need to learn these truths when you have a friendship disagreement. Number one, God is sovereign over the silliness. God can take our arguments and work them for his glory. Like in this case, there were two men who were fixed in their position, and they started, instead of having one missionary team, they actually created two missionary teams. God used the disagreement for his glory and the furtherance of the gospel. God is sovereign over the silliness. Here's another one. You don't need to know the heart of your friend. Only God does. In verse 8, there's two Greek words there. Cardio, when it says God knows. Cardio, where we get our word cardiologist, and then gnosis, where we get our word knowledge. God is literally a divine cardiologist. He's a heart knower. God knows the heart. Now, I don't know this. I'm about to preach the gaps here. I think Paul was a perfectionist. I think he was probably a hypercritical guy. I really have trouble with hypercritical people. They just annoy me. It does. I abhor cynicism. It's just repulsive to me. The most critical people you know are also the most blinded people you know. I can't believe she wore that dress. What is she wearing? And the whole time you're thinking, like, what, you're criticizing her? Did your kids dress you today? What is wrong with you? Like, the most critical people are always the most blinded people. He is such a loser. You're living in your mom's basement. You are 42 years old, living in your mom's basement. He's blinded. So how do you handle a disagreement? What do you do? If you've been wrong, like John Mark, I think John Mark was the one that was really wronged in all of this. Don't hold a grudge. We know later Paul and John Mark, they worked together, even though there was a time they had a disagreement. Sometimes time heals wounds, but until time heals wounds, if you've been wrong, confess it, apologize for it. If you haven't been wrong, be the first to try to make it right anyway. Here's the last thing. God has a John Mark for you. Will you encourage people who have made the wrong decision? They've already messed up. Like, and their life is obvious. They've messed up. They don't need you coming in and saying, hey, look at this, and look what you did, what it cost. How do you do that? Never by minimizing a person's sin, but by telling them that God can turn their sin into good. There are people in every row who are struggling. They need a Barney to come by and encourage them. Can't you just picture Barnabas talking to Mark? Get up, Mark. Yes, you've sinned, but God still has something for you. Some of you today, you've sinned and you've wondered if God can still use you. He can. Repent of that sin and move forward in grace. Some of us bailed out because of fear. Some of us bailed out because of anger. Some of us bailed out by cursing. Some of us bailed out by sexual sin. I'm here to tell you, your failure does not define you. Don't listen to that lie that it's all over. It's never over when Jesus is on the scene. Don't let what people say about you paralyze you. Listen to what Jesus has said about you. The righteous man falls 6 times. What does Scripture say? He gets up 7. That's grace. Let's be a church full of grace. And if we err, let's err on grace. Let's stand together.